Welcome back to the Scarlet Letter, Chapter 9. Here we go with the Leech. Under the appellation of Roger Chillingworth, the reader will remember, was hidden another name, which its former wearer had resolved should never more be spoken. It has been related how, in the crowd that witnessed Hester Prynne's ignominious exposure, stood a man, elderly, travel-worn, who, just emerging from the perilous wilderness, beheld the woman in whom he hoped to find embodied the warmth and cheerfulness of home, set up as a type of sin before the people. Here we've had an example of third-person romantic irony when the narrator speaks specifically to us. We have, just that. Her matronly frame was trodden under all men's feet. Infamy was babbling around her in the public marketplace. For her kindred, should the tidings ever reach them, and for the companions of their unspotted life, there remained nothing but the contagion of her dishonor, which would not fail to be distributed in strict accordance, arid proportion, with the intimacy and sacredness of their previous relationship. This is more or less just saying that she had shamed her entire family. Then why, since the choice was with himself, should the individual whose connection with the fallen woman had been the most intimate and sacred of them all come forward to vindicate his claim to an inheritance so little desirable? He resolved not to be pilloried beside her on her pedestal of shame. Unknown to all but Hester Prynne, and possessing the lock and key of her silence, he chose to withdraw his name from the roll of mankind, and, as regarded his former ties and interest, to vanish out of life as completely as if he indeed lay at the bottom of the ocean, whither rumor had long ago consigned him. The rhetorical question is saying, it's explaining why he wouldn't want to be known, because she had brought so much shame and dishonor on their family and on him. Why would he want to stand up and get punished alongside her and be associated with her and her sin? The possession of the lock and key of her silence would be a metaphor. However, it's pretty straightforward in its statement. This purpose once effected, new interests would immediately spring up, and likewise a new purpose, dark, it is true, if not guilty, but of force enough to engage the full strength of his faculties. That would be speaking specifically to the revenge he is seeking on the, to him, unknown baby daddy. And it's also a great textual evidence to display his intentions and the nature of his intentions, and the fact that it is dark, true, if not guilty, but of force enough. In pursuance of this resolve, he took up his residence in the Puritan town as Roger Chillingworth, without other introduction than the learning and intelligence of which he possessed more than a common measure. As his studies, at a previous period of his life, had made him extensively acquainted with the medical science of the day, it was as a physician that he presented himself, and as such was cordially received. Skillful men of the medical and chirurgical profession, were of rare occurrence in the colony. They seldom, it would appear, partook of the religious zeal that brought their other emigrants across the Atlantic. In their researches into the human frame, it may be that the higher and more subtle faculties of such men were materialized, and that they lost the spiritual view of existence amid the intricacies of that wondrous mechanism, which seemed to involve art enough to compromise all of life within itself. To comprise. So this is saying that he was a very rare sight in the colonies because of his profession. Even though it was an assumed profession, he could fake it well, as he did have some actual knowledge about medicinal qualities. At all events, the health of the good town of Boston, so far as medicine had aught to do with it, had hitherto lain in the guardianship of an aged deacon and apothecary, whose piety and godly deportment were stronger testimonials in his favor than any that he could have produced in the shape of a diploma. The old surgeon was one who combined the occasional exercise of that noble art with the daily and habitual flourish of a razor. I'm going to move here. That just told you that he's a barber. He cuts hair, or possibly a butcher, but I wouldn't go there. I would assume that would have been a knife instead of a razor. And historically, surgeons were people who were barbers. which is actually why they had the red and white striped pole. You know what I'm talking about. You hear me. Because they used to put the red bloody rags out. Jackson Hiles. I can't say that on camera. Silly. To such a professional body, Roger Chillingworth was a brilliant acquisition. He soon manifested his familiarity with the ponderous and imposing machinery of antique physic, in which every remedy contained a multitude of far-fetched and heterogeneous ingredients, as elaborately compounded as if the proposed result had been the elixir of life. That is an allusion. You are supposed to understand the reference to the elixir of life. In his Indian captivity, moreover, he had gained much knowledge of the properties of native herbs and roots, nor did he conceal from his patients that these simple medicines, nature's boon to the untutored savage, had quite as large a share of his own confidence as the European pharmacopoeia, which so many learned doctors had spent centuries in elaborating. The pharma would be a root having to do with medicinal qualities, medicine, and then the copia would be like the large grouping thereof. I don't have a better way to explain that, but there you go. This learned stranger was exemplary as regarded at least the outward forms of a religious life, and early after his arrival had chosen for his spiritual guide the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale. The young divine, whose scholar-like renown still lived in Oxford, was considered by his more fervent admirers as little less than a heavenly ordained apostle, destined, should he live and labor for the ordinary term of life, to do as great deeds for the now feeble New England Church as the early fathers had achieved for the infancy of the Christian faith. So they're saying that Dimmesdale was still known back in Oxford, where he would have trained, that he was quite literally sent from heaven as an apostle to the people. He is super high up in regard with regards to anything religious, which is in itself slightly ironic, as the reader already knows that he is the baby daddy, and seeing as he is continuing to stay hidden with his secret sin, the irony ensues, especially with this next potential sentence. About this period, however, the health of Mr. Dimmesdale had evidently begun to fail. The irony here is that his new bestie is a doctor, and at the same time that his new bestie is a doctor, his health starts to fail. We obviously know the irony in this because we know that his health is failing as he is under the crushing burden of his sin. But to the outside world, it would seem very ironic that as his relationship grows with Chillingworth, his health actually declines. By those best acquainted with his habits, the paleness of the young minister's cheek was accounted for by his too earnest devotion to study, his scrupulous fulfillment of parochial duty, and more than that, to the fasts and vigils of which he made a frequent practice, in order to keep the grossness of this earthly state from clogging and obscuring his spiritual lamp. There is no spiritual lamp, therefore it is a metaphor, although the spiritual lamp itself is a metaphor. So it's a metaphor and a metaphor. Mind blown. Some declare that if Mr. Dimmesdale were really going to die, it was cause enough that the world was not worthy to be any longer trodden by his feet. He himself, on the other hand, was characteristic humility, avowed his belief that if Providence should see fit to remove him, it would be because of his own unworthiness to perform its humblest mission here on earth. With all this difference of opinion as to the cause of his decline, there should be no question of the fact. His form grew emaciated. His voice, though still rich and sweet, had a certain melancholy, prophecy of decay in it. He was so often observed on any slight alarm or other sudden accident to put his hand over his heart, with first a flush and then a paleness, indicative of pain. This is at least the second time in this text that it has been noted that he does put his hand over his heart, especially in a moment of startle. And this is something that I believe is going to continue on, and I know for a fact it does. So there you go. Such was the young clergyman's condition, and so imminent the prospect that his dawning light would be extinguished, all untimely, when Roger Chillingworth made his advent to the town. The dawning light being extinguished would be a nicer way of saying he would die. Therefore, the more polite, nicer way of saying something would be considered a euphemism. It might also potentially be foreshadowing something towards the end of the book. We do know that the very first chapter ends with the warning of the sad tale of human frailty and sorrow that was to unfold in the pages to come. So there's that. His first entry on the scene, few people could tell whence, dropping down as if it were out of the sky or starting from the nether earth, had an aspect of mystery, which was easily heightened to the miraculous. He was now known to be a man of skill. It was observed that he gathered herbs and the blossoms of wild flowers and dug up roots and plucked off twigs from the forest trees, like one acquainted with hidden virtues in what was valueless to common eyes. He was heard to speak of Sir Kenelm Digby and other famous men, whose scientific attainments were esteemed hardly less than supernatural, as having been his correspondents or associates. That would be an allusion to a super famous medical guy. It would be assumed that you would understand why that would be his name drop. And also we have another instance of supernatural coming up, which we've learned is a motif that comes up repeatedly throughout the text and should be noted. Why, with such rank in the learned world, had he come hither? What could he, whose sphere was in great cities, be seeking in the wilderness? In answer to this query, a rumor gained ground, and however absurd, was entertained by some very sensible people, that heaven had wrought an absolute miracle by transporting an eminent doctor of physic from a German university bodily through the air and setting him down at the door of Mr. Dimmesdale's study. Are you okay? Individuals of wiser faith, indeed, who knew that heaven promotes its purposes without aiming at the stage effect of what is called miraculous interposition, were inclined to see a providential hand in Roger Chillingworth's so opportune arrival. As we do know that he is kind of evil and creepy-ish, it is interesting that so many people would liken him to an angel sent from heaven, or at least a human sent with divine intervention in order to aid the alien minister. This idea was countenanced by the strong interest which the physician ever manifested in the young clergyman. He attached himself to him as a parishioner and sought to win a friendly regard and confidence from his naturally reserved sensibility. He expressed great alarm at his pastor's state of health, but, what anxious to attempt the cure, and, if early undertaken, seemed not despondent of a favorable result. The elders, the deacons, the motherly dames, and the young and fair maidens of Mr. Dimmesdale's flock were alike importunate that he should make trial of the physician's frankly offered skill. Mr. Dimmesdale gently repelled their entreaties. So everybody, including every single person in the congregation, was hoping that they would, that he would take the help of Chillingworth, so that he could get better, but he constantly turned the aid away. "I need no medicine," said he. But how could the young minister say so when, with every successive Sabbath, his cheek was paler and thinner, and his voice more tremulous than before, when it had now become a constant habit, rather than a casual gesture, to press his hand over his heart? Was he weary of his labors? Did he wish to die? These questions were solemnly propounded to Mr. Dimmesdale by the elder ministers of Boston and the deacons of his church, who, to use their own phrase, dealt with him on the sin of rejecting the aid which Providence so manifestly held out. He listened in silence and finally promised to confer with the physician. "Were it God's will," said the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale, when, in fulfillment of this pledge, he requested old Roger Chillingworth's professional advice, "I could be well content that my labors, and my sorrows, and my sins, and my pains should shortly end with me, and what is earthly of them be buried in my grave, and the spiritual go with me to my eternal state, rather than that you should put your skill to the proof in my behalf." So he's even still saying if God was to be kind, he'd just remove me from this earth and not waste your time or your skill on a poor miserable sinner such as I. Ah, replied Roger Chillingworth, with that quietness which, whether imposed or natural, marked all of his deportment. It is thus that a young clergyman is apt to speak. Youthful men, not having taken a deep root, give up their hold of life so easily, and saintly men who walk with God on earth, would fain be away to walk with him on the golden pavements of the New Jerusalem. You have another allusion which is pretty blatant. Nay, rejoined the young minister, putting his hand to his heart with a flush of pain flitting over his brow. Were I worthier to walk there, I could be better content to toil here. So he's saying that he doesn't even think he's necessarily going to heaven. He's not worthy of that righteousness that the town and everyone else assumes that he has. Good men ever interpret themselves too meanly, said the physician. You're being too hard on yourself. In this manner, the mysterious old Roger Chillingworth became the medical adviser of the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale, as not only the disease interested the physician, but he was strongly moved to look into the character and qualities of the patient. These two men, so different in age, came gradually to spend much time together. For the sake of the minister's health, and to enable the leech to gather plants with healing balm in them, they took long walks on the seashore or in the forest, mingling various walks with the splash and murmur of the waves, and the solemn wind anthem among the treetops. Often, likewise, one was the guest of the other in his place of study and retirement. There was a fascination for the minister in the company of a man of science, in whom he recognized an intellectual cultivation of no moderate depth or scope, together with a range of freedom of ideas that he would have vainly looked for among the members of his own profession. Roger Chillingworth had a deep intellect and willingness to discuss topics in a way that other pastors wouldn't have, and so he being Dimmesdale, was getting something out of their friendship as well. In truth, he was startled, if not shocked, to find this attribute in the physician. Mr. Dimmesdale was a true priest, a true religionist, with a reverential sentiment largely developed, and an order of mind that impelled itself powerfully along the track of a creed, and wore its passage continually deeper with the lapse of time. In no state of society would he have been what is called a man of liberal views. It would always be essential to his peace to feel the pressure of a faith about him, supporting, while it confined him, with its iron framework. That faith is supporting and confining him, which could be considered personification, and you could also make a case as to why it wouldn't be, because do humans really support and confine? But in a way we kind of do, so that's interesting. Not the less, however, though, with a tremulous enjoyment, did he feel the occasional relief of looking at the universe through the medium of another kind of intellect than those with which he habitually held converse. It was as if a window were thrown open, admitting a freer atmosphere into the close and stifled study, where his life was wasting itself away amid lamplight or obstructed daybeams and the musty fragrance, be it sensual or moral, that exhales from books. We have a lot of stuff here. So it was as if a window had been thrown open as a simile. He's saying that Roger Chillingworth and the discussions they were able to have was a breath of fresh air. We have the fact that his life was wasting away, which is describing his descent in bodily constitution. One could say that the obstructed daybeams may be referenced as a kenning, which if you recall, is a two-word phrase meant to replace a single noun. So instead of saying the moon, like in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the monster calls it the night orb. Or my other big example is that if you needed a kenning for a chair, you might call it a butt hammock. So daylight, day beams, something such as that. And the musty fragrance, sensual or moral, that exhales from books. I love that imagery, especially the fact that I love the smell of books. But the air was too fresh and chill to be long breathed with comfort. So the minister and the physician with him withdrew again within the limits of what their church defined as orthodox. Thus, Roger Chillingworth scrutinized his patient carefully, both as he saw him in his ordinary life, keeping an accustomed pathway in the range of thoughts familiar to him, and as he appeared when thrown amidst other moral scenery, the novelty of which might call out something new to the surface of his character. He deemed it essential, it would seem, to know the man before attempting to do him good. Wherever there is a heart and an intellect, the disease of the physical frame are tinged with the peculiarities of these. I most definitely have a theme question mark next to that. I'm not positive if it's going to cover everything throughout the novel, but if nothing else, it might lead toward a thematic topic. But wherever there is a heart and an intellect, a mind and a soul, the disease of the actual body are tinged with the peculiarities of that heart and soul. So he's kind of saying that our physical health is in part dependent upon our spiritual health and mental health kind of as well. In Arthur Dimmesdale, thought and imagination were so active and sensibility so intense that the bodily infirmity would be likely to have its groundwork there. So Roger Chillingworth, the man of skill, the kind and friendly physician, strove to go deep into his patient's bosom, delving among his principles, prying into his recollections, and probing everything with a cautious touch, like a treasure seeker in a dark cavern. Here we have parallelism in the action at the beginning of the phrases, such as strove to go deep, delving among his principles, prying into his recollections, probing everything, cautious touch. And also the entire thing is used as a simile to liken him to a treasure seeker in a dark cavern. It also is describing how Dimmesdale kind of is dealing with keeping so much secret inside. Few secrets can escape an investigator who has opportunity and license to undertake such a quest and skill to follow it up. That should remind you of something that was said earlier, and if something comes up again and again, it should be noted. A man burdened with a secret should especially avoid the intimacy of his physician. If the latter possesses native sagacity, and a nameless something more, let us call it intuition, if he show no intrusive egotism, nor disagreeable prominent characteristics of his own, if he have the power, which must be born with him, to bring his mind into such affinity with his patients, that this last shall unawares have spoken what he imagines himself only to have thought, if such relations be received without tumult, and acknowledged not so often by an uttered sympathy as by silence, an inarticulate breath, and here and there a word to indicate that all is understood. If to these qualifications of a confidant be joined the advantages afforded by this his recognized character as a physician, then at some inevitable moment will the soul of the sufferer be dissolved and flow forth in a dark but transparent stream, bringing all its mysteries into the daylight. Holy long sentence. That sentence started for me almost halfway up the page. Whoa, that was a lot. So he's saying that there's no way that Dimmesdale can hide everything from Chillingworth because Chillingworth is brilliant. He has intuition. He has wisdom, the sagacity. It's not egotism. He's not trying to, which I think maybe is a little egotism. But anyway, he's saying that at some point Dimmesdale is going to do something, and it will eventually lead to a complete purging or a catharsis. Gentlemen, we don't share headbuds or earbuds. A complete purging of what's going on, and everything would be brought into the daylight, which would be a metaphor for to be known. Roger Chillingworth possessed all or most of the attributes above enumerated. Nevertheless, time went on. A kind of intimacy, as we have said, grew up between these two cultivated minds, which had as wide a field as the whole sphere of human thought and study to meet upon. They discussed every topic of ethics and religion, of public affairs and private character. They talked much on both sides of matters that seemed personal to themselves, and yet no secret, such as the physician fancied must exist there, ever stole out of the minister's consciousness into his companion's ear. The latter had his suspicions, indeed, that even the nature of Mr. Dimmesdale's bodily disease had never fairly been revealed to him. It was a strange reserve. After a time, at the hint from Roger Chillingworth, the friends of Mr. Dimmesdale effected an arrangement by which the two were lodged in the same house, so that every ebb and flow of the minister's life tide might pass under the eye of his anxious and attached physician. If you haven't already, you should be kind of creeped out by the fact that Chillingworth is like obsessed with Dimmesdale. He is super he's literally to the point where they are now living together so that he can observe everything, trying to figure this out. But he's also devoted, and it's somewhat commendable that he has put so much effort forth in this matter. But it's also ironic because we know that Dimmesdale is baby daddy and has that guilt-ridden heart, which is part of the reason why he's having his issues the way he is. So there was much joy throughout the town when this greatly desirable object was attained. It was held to be the best possible measure for the young clergyman's welfare, unless, indeed, as often urged by such as felt authorized to do so, he had selected one of the many blooming damsels, spiritually devoted to him, to become his devoted wife. So now they're saying that Roger Chillingworth, the old physician, was like second choice to getting married, but at least he would have help. This latter step, thus speaking of getting married, however, there was no present prospect that Arthur Dimmesdale would be prevailed upon to take. He rejected all suggestions of the kind, as if priestly celibacy were one of his articles of church discipline. Doomed by his own choice, therefore, as Mr. Dimmesdale so evidently was, to eat his unsavory morsel always at another's board, and endure the lifelong chill which must be his lot, who seeks to warm himself only at another's fireside. It truly seemed that this sagacious, experienced, benevolent old physician was his concord of paternal and reverential love for the young pastor, was the very man of all mankind to be consistently within reach of his voice. So they were now tied together as they were living with one another. The reference to Mr. Dimmesdale eating his morsel at another's board would be the way of saying his food would always come from another's kitchen. It would never be his own. He would always be someone who would board at another's home. The new abode of the two friends was with a pious widow of good social rank who dwelt in a house covering pretty nearly the site on which the venerable structure of King's Chapel has since been built. It had the graveyard, originally Isaac Johnson's home field, on one side, and so was well adapted to call up serious reflections, suited to their respective employments in both minister and man of physic. So just outside their window was the cemetery, which can be ironic or juxtaposition or several things depending on how this turns out. The motherly care of the good widow assigned to Mr. Dimmesdale a front apartment with a sunny exposure and heavy window curtains to create a noontide shadow when desirable. The walls were hung around with tapestry, said to have been from Gobelin looms, which would be an illusion, and at all events representing the spiritual story of David and Bathsheba. Interesting, ironic, and Nathan the prophet. Also irony? In colors still unfaded, but which made the fair woman of the scene almost as grimly picturesque as the woe-denouncing seer. Here, the pale clergyman piled up his library, rich with parchment-bound folios of the fathers and the lore of rabbis and monkish erudition, of which the Protestant divines, even while judging you, even while they vilified and decried the class of writers, were yet constrained often to avail themselves. On the other side of the house, old Roger Chillingworth arranged his study and laboratory, not so much as a modern man of science would reckon even tolerably complete, but providing with a distilling apparatus and the means of compounding drugs and chemicals, which the practiced alchemist knew well how to turn to purpose. With such commoditiness of situation, these two learned persons sat themselves down, each in his own domain, yet familiarly passing from one apartment to the other, and bestowing a mutual and not incurious inspection into one another's business. And the Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale's best discerning friends, as we have intimated, very reasonably imagined that the hand of Providence had done all of this for the purpose, besought in so many public and domestic the secret prayers, of restoring the young minister to health. But it must now be said another portion of the community had latterly begun to take its own view of the relation betwixt Mr. Dimmesdale and the mysterious old physician. When an uninstructed multitude attempts to see with its eyes, it is exceedingly apt to be deceived. The uninstructed multitude to see with its eyes. So this is one part, the eyes, used to represent the whole of a large society or community. Therefore, I would consider that a synecdoche. And this is all about what you see versus how you feel. When, however, it forms its judgment, as it usually does, on the intuitions of its great and warm heart, the conclusions thus attained are often so profound and so unerring as to possess the character of truth, supernaturally revealed. The people, in the case of which we speak, could justify its prejudice against Roger Chillingworth, but by no fact or argument worthy of serious refutation. There was an aged handicraftsman, it is true, who had been a citizen of London at the period of Sir Thomas Overbury's murder, now some 30 years agone. He testified to have having seen the physician under some other name, which the narrator of the story had now forgotten, in company with Dr. Foreman, the famous old conjurer, who was implicated in the affair of Overbury. 2 or 3 individuals hinted that the man of skill during his Indian captivity had enlarged his medical attainments by joining in the incantation of the savage priests, who were universally acknowledged to be powerful enchanters, often performing seemingly miraculous cures by their skill in the black art, which would be synonymous with black magic. So this is all talking about, there was an allusion with the Thomas Overbury, but it's also all hinting at the fact that some people, without really having good reason, assumed that Roger Chillingworth was evil and was possibly working for the devil. And obviously there is some truth to knowing that somebody says that they had recognized him once from back in England under a different name, because he, at that point, his last name would have been Prynne. A large number, and many of these, were persons of such sober sense and practical observation that their opinions would have been valuable in other matters, affirmed that Roger Chillingworth's aspect had undergone a remarkable change while he had dwelt in town, and especially since his abode with Mr. Dimmesdale. At first, his expression had been calm, meditative, scholar-like. That was a syndeton. Now, there was something ugly and evil in his face, which they had not previously noticed, and which grew still the more obvious to sight the oftener they looked upon him. According to the vulgar idea, the fire in his lavatory had been brought from the lower regions, and was fed with infernal fire, and so, as might be expected, his visage was getting sooty with the smoke. So they're starting to use some textual evidence here. You could use this textual evidence here as the Hawthorne is writing unnamed characters to explain his physical changes due to the result of his seeking of revenge. I have one paragraph left I'm going to finish, but you guys can totally take off. To sum up the matter, it grew to be a widely diffused opinion that the Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale, like many other personages of special sanctity in all ages of the Christian world, was haunted either by Satan himself or Satan's emissary in the guise of old Roger Chillingworth. This diabolical agent had the divine permission for a season to burrow into the clergyman's intimacy and plot against his soul. No sensible man, it was confessed, could doubt on which side the victory would turn. The people looked with an unshaken hope to see the minister come forth out of the conflict transfigured with the glory which he would unquestionably win. Meanwhile, nevertheless, it was sad to think of the perchance mortal agony through which he must struggle toward his triumph. Alas, to judge from the gloom and terror in the depth of the poor minister's eyes, the battle was a sore one, and the victory anything but secure. This would be foreshadowing, because it is saying that although he is fighting through the evil nature of Chillingworth, everybody can see the physical demands and how it's taking a toll on him, and how it doesn't even really look all that promising. Also, you will notice that there, in the sentences, the people looked with unshaken hope that the minister comes out of the conflict transfigured. You could use this as textual evidence to make a case for the fact that that Dimmesdale is a Christ-like character written by Hawthorne to have this be an allegory for Christ's unselfish sacrifice for all people. And so that's an interesting way to look at this, and we'll wrap up that chapter, and I'll do chapter 10 a little later. Have a great day. Thanks. What?